Kids, this is the story of how I met your mother.
You already told us that one.
Oh yeah, I did.
Dad, why don't you tell us something cool for once?
Cool. Alright, let me tell you the story of how I learned about the ethics of data journalism.
That's not exactly...
It was the fall of 2017. Kids, journalists, in this case data journalists, have a duty to serve the interests of the American people, to report the truth and nothing but the truth. But sometimes the truth can be difficult to understand. It's up to the data journalist to disseminate information necessary to arrive closer to the truth and to provide context while making the information more comprehensible. In a polarized world, some data journalists might wield their power in the wrong way, withholding critical information to the public, neglecting to fact-check or provide context, or even manipulating data to benefit their agenda or that of a higher entity. And so the question was, how can we as data journalists ensure that the information we disseminate is understandable, truthful, and accurate, relevant to the public at that moment in time, cognizant of others who might be a part of a greater statistic, and above all, independent from our own biases or that of other entities. Hey look, it's David Muir.
David, love your work. Hire me?
Remind me never to get into an elevator with him.
Kids, do you guys even pay attention in Professor Loop's class?
Of course, I need to know who to play at the Flex this week.
Ooh, sports. Woo!
Meg, put that laptop down. Thank you. Now where was I? Kids, data journalism started back in 1952 when CBS News used a computer to predict the outcomes of the presidential election between Dwight D. Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. The computer was used during the first ever coast-to-coast broadcast of a presidential election. It collected data as results came in when polls closed and predicted an easy win for Eisenhower. Although the computer had predicted the correct results, the public was wary of its accuracy at first. It wasn't until a few years later that computer-assisted reporting picked up momentum.
Data journalism is it's an evolving field within journalism generally. It came out of an early movement in the 60s and the 70s that coalesced into something called computer-assisted reporting. And the idea back then was to capitalize on the new computational power that computers were offering newsrooms, and to begin to do things that look a little more like social science and a little less like the sort of anecdotal information newspapers often operate with.
In 1990, Steve Doig of the Miami Herald used data to explore problems in development and policy for housing in Florida after experiencing the devastation from Hurricane Andrew. Doig noticed that older houses survived the storm better than the newer houses in the area. This led him to discovering that builders in the area were using staples to install roofs, but the building inspectors, since they had to check more buildings than they were supposed to, overlooked these issues. He exposed this dilemma through his data and won a Pulitzer Prize for his work in 1993.
That's great and all, but I don't really see the ethical dilemmas here.
Fine, fine. If you want to know about the ethical dilemmas, I will give them to you. Just say please.
Please.
Thank you. Now where was I? So kids, as you know, there are many ways of obtaining data, especially with the internet nowadays. However, when you think about it, most journalists, no rather most people, are unfamiliar with simple math skills such as percent increases and averages. For this reason, all the data the public has access to is often taken at face value.
We noticed there was a glaring need for clarification rather than simply taking it on faith. People now aren't really interested in research or finding their own opinion. They're interested in whatever's presented. We're a 30-second society now. We want answers yesterday. We want solutions last week. So taking the time to look at information critically is something that's been lost, I think, in the shuffle.
The Data Journalism Handbook presents a good point. The fact that journalists need help in math topics normally covered before high school shows just how far today's newsrooms are from being data literate.
Okay. Well, how are they supposed to present the data correctly?
Well, Jason, the handbook suggests 3 questions journalists should pose. 1. How was the data collected? Think critically about the data you are reading. Always double check the data the same way you double check a quote. 2. What's in there to learn? Break the data down to help your readers understand what you are talking about and for you to understand what you are presenting. 3. How reliable is the information? Make sure any relevant correlations or pieces of information are taken into account by the researchers. My professor from the good old days back on the South Hill of Ithaca told me using the tools of data collection correctly can help make a journalist's story stronger. She and her co-teacher train their students in their seminar course to use these correctly.
There are so many tools available now for data collection and sorting data, and that's great. But what kind of training exists for that? So when you think about it, today we talk about college students not being able to type using Microsoft Word, or they haven't learned keyboarding. I think we take for granted that because there are tools available to us, that we just inherently know how to use them. And I don't think that we do know how to use them.
No.
So in that sense, I think that's usually from a journalist perspective where you run into problems with data collection is, do I actually know what I'm looking at or what I'm looking for? Mm-hmm. And is it really a correlation, or is one thing causing the other?
Well, what happens if you're collecting data for a story you already know a lot about?
Now, Meg, as a journalist, you never assume you know the outcome. You know better than that. Go in with objectivity in order to obtain the most accurate results.
If any interviewer has a feeling about how the results are going to turn out, I think that's an inherent danger. Like with the pizza question, we could have 40, we could ask 50 people and we could be standing in front of Pizza Hut or something like that, so, whether there's a subliminal message there or not, I think you always run that kind of risk. Or if you even get into an emotional kind of question, if the interviewer kind of, gives his or her hand before the second question's even asked, then I think that you're almost like leading the witness, and you want to kind of stay away from that.
It's the proverb of the drunkard and the lamplight, and the story goes that you encounter a drunk person who is wandering around at nighttime under a lamp or a street light, and you ask him or her, what are you doing? And he says, I'm looking for my keys. And then you say, well, why do you assume they're here? And he or she says, well, because that's where the light is. Right? And the metaphor is that we tend to look for things where we can see them and not where we can't see them. And so if data is collected in a way that doesn't account for, the dark corners of the world, we can get a very skewed picture. And so think about, any kind of crime or health-related or environment-related data relating to a community. If we're not careful about how that data is collected, we can get a very positive or very negative picture that may not reflect the holistic picture for the given population or the given community. So, anyway.
This seems kind of boring. I don't want to read a bunch of numbers. Where's the story?
Kids, please. Have you not been listening? Data journalism is strictly about the numbers. It's about combining the numbers with your story to make it stronger.
If you're finding a story that's, based around numbers and, statistics and things like that, that you'd still want to find people that it affects and more characters to sort of build the story around a lot of times, because I think, most people will be a lot more receptive to that than just I don't know, this is, 3% up or something like that, right?
I think that we're quick to accept something that we see on social media, but I also think that we're quick to question something, and especially if we feel strongly about it. So I think the data to support things are what makes us an overall informed society. I don't think we can go along with just what I saw on social media. You know, a tweeted headline is not enough, but if I can click on that and then you're going to back that up with factual information or data and numbers, I now feel more informed.
Look, Dad, all this is great and all, but what does it mean?
What do you mean, what does it mean?
How can I apply any of this?
Well, son, I'm glad you asked. Let's look at an example.
Here we go again.
In 2012, a newspaper based in Westchester County in New York decided to publish something online that has been referred to as the Westchester Gun Map. The reporters at the paper did a public records request for all individuals who had made gun permit requests and then fed all the data they had into Google Fusion Tables.
Google Fusion Tables did and still does provide a very simple mechanism where if you have data that has an address, it will geolocate it and it will show it on a map, and it's interactive, so you can click on the little dot and the dot will show you the underlying information. It'll show you the address and all this.
So the way that the newspaper presented this information revealed the addresses of people in their area? Isn't that private information?
Well, that's the thing. All of this information is accessible through FOIA because they're on public record. But you could make the argument that the way the newspaper showed the data was faulty and putting people at risk.
The way that it was published was not informative, and to many people felt like a violation of privacy. Okay, so essentially what they had done is they had obviously published a map with the home address of everyone who had applied for a handgun permit. Now, there are reasons why this was not appropriate. This wasn't even good data for the story they were trying to tell. I mean, the headline of this map was "The Gun Owner Next Door." There's a whole bunch of reasons why that data set doesn't tell that story, because people who apply for permits don't necessarily have weapons. Even those that do have weapons may not keep them at their home. Many of them may keep them at gun ranges, so it doesn't mean that there is a gun at that residence. Some of the data was outdated. The way that it was presented did not, it was this sort of kind of illegible cluster of dots on a map. It didn't show you anything about density. It didn't show you, in other words, it didn't add any kind of analytical layer that helped you as a reader understand any kind of, pattern about what was happening, about what that information was.
So, what happened?
Well, Sierra, people who were mad about the map posted addresses of the editorial board online, the newspaper had to hire security guards, and people got mad. It was this whole thing. Eventually, the map was removed.
Huh?
So, kids, bad data aside, do you think the newspaper did the right thing?
That seems like a hard question to answer.
Maybe, kids, but we can always use the Potter box to think about it. So let's walk through a Potter box example. The empirical definition of the dilemma would be whether or not the newspaper should publish the addresses of people who applied for gun permits online. Next, let's look at our values. Let's say the newspaper values transparency. It wants to be as open as possible with its data. However, transparency is at odds with privacy here. On top of that, a newspaper should value truth, but as Susan McGregor said, the data they used didn't really help the story they were trying to tell. Then let's think about ethical principles. In this case, it could be said the paper used the Rand rational self-interest principle, as they wanted to publish the data to advance the article and ultimately their paper. They did not believe this data would be infringing, so they believed it was publishable, but it was infringing in fact. If the data was not published, it could have appealed to the golden mean principle of everything in moderation, respecting the privacy of sources. Kids, finally let's talk about where our loyalties lie. In this case, a newspaper is loyal to its audience. It's supposed to present relevant data while also protecting their sources. So kids, knowing all of this and looking at the Potter box model we've just constructed, what do we think the newspaper should have done?
I don't think they should have published it. The data they used was wrong, and they put their sources at risk, and it didn't really add to the story they were trying to tell.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, the data was already public, and it wasn't like they did anything unethical when they published it.
Either way, I think all of these issues are part of a bigger holistic issue. What can be done about that?
Well, that's a good question. Journalists need to be transparent, truthful, and report as accurately as they can. They owe it to the public to explain to them not only the importance of issues, but why issues may be hard to understand as well. My good friend YB said it best.
above all, what we need to do is make sure to explain to viewers, to readers, that there is uncertainty in data. One thing that is not a tradition in journalism is talking much about uncertainty.
Right.
So these numbers seem to suggest X, but they may not be of uncertainty in almost everything we report, and yet we seldom ever try to characterize or capture that. I think one thing from my perspective I'd love to see more of is ways for journalism to do that. I wonder if the public, which is now expressing very, very poor evaluations of news media, trust in media, if what's going on is that the public is just trusting institutions across the board much less than it once did. You can see the trend lines over 40 years. Whether it's Congress or religious institutions or almost across the board, we see this kind of decline in trust. And so I wonder if what journalism needs to respond with is a more kind of subtle way of framing how we render things for the public. And it seems kind of maybe even wimpy to say, like, hey, this is our story. This is what we think is true, but we're not really sure. Right? Journalists don't like to do that. But maybe it's time to start thinking about, trying to do a little more of that, being a little more humble, putting ourselves more in the position of kind of referee as opposed to like judge and executioner, if that makes any sense.
And that, kids, is the story of how I learned about the ethics of data journalism. Pretty cool, huh?
I guess.
It was alright.
Kind of long.
Sure, Dad.
Cool.
I am ashamed. Well, fine, you want to hear another story? This is about how I met your Uncle Meade Luke.
No!